So in this video, we'll be learning about row echelon form, which is known as REF. So let's first see what does REF mean or row echelon form mean. So here we have some matrices and I'll be going over what is REF. So the first step to see is the first non-zero, look for the first non-zero element in the first row, which in our case is going to be 7, right? So this is what is called a pivot. So this 7 is our first pivot, and we look for numbers below this 7, this pivot, and they all have to be 0. Basically, you cannot have any non-zero numbers below this pivot. So here we have 0 and 0, so that's a pass. Now moving on, we look down and to the right. So our next pivot in the second row is going to be -1. And again, we look below this pivot, and if there is any non-zero values below this pivot, we don't have any, we only have a 0, so that's fine. And in our third row, we have 4 as our pivot. So again, from -1, look down and to the right. So basically diagonally, and 4 is our last pivot here. So the first matrix is in REF. Now moving on, let's look over here. So we have the first pivot as -12, so that's fine. And now look down, we look down, so we have both of them 0, so that's a pass. Now moving on, from here we look down and to the right. So in our second row we have the pivot to be 1, right? Now again we look below it and we see that there is a 8. So this 8 violates the REF rule that you cannot have any non-zero number below the pivot, so this is not REF. Now let's move on to the next example. We have 6 as our first pivot, non-zero. Look for the first non-zero element in the first row. Look below it now. Do we have any values below it? Only 0, so that's fine. Now down and to the right, so 7 is our next pivot, and we look below that 7 and we have zeros again. And in our last row we have all zeros. Now there is a rule that states that whenever you have a 0 row, meaning that all of the values are 0, it has to be all the way down in REF. So here it is all the way, it's the last row, so this is also REF in REF, I mean to say. Now moving on, so the first thing that we notice here is that we have the non-zero, or sorry, the 0 row in our first row. So automatically we can say that this is not REF. If we do have a 0 row, it has to be all the way down, or the last row basically. So not REF. Now let's quickly go over a few more. So here, this is our first pivot, and we notice that we have two more 0 rows, and we don't have any other pivot. So this 1 is our only pivot, and this is an REF. Oops. Okay, anyways, we'll just finish this up. So in our next matrix, we have this one here. And again, we always look down. If there is any non-zeros value, we don't. So this is also an REF. And in our last question, we have 1 as our first pivot. And now we'll again look down and to the right. So we have 4 zeros and then a 1. And this one is our next non-zero element in the next row, right? So this is our second pivot, and we don't have any non-zero values below it, so this is also in REF. So all these three are in REF. So now let's see how we can convert a matrix into REF. So now let's do a 3 by 3 matrix example. So we have 1, 2, and 3, and we have 4, 6, 8, and then 0, 5, 3. And we want to convert this into REF. So now first of all, we look for the first pivot in our first row, which is going to be 1, right? And now we look for numbers below it. We need to eliminate any non-zero elements, and we notice that we have a 4 here. So what we can do here to get rid of this 4 is we can perform a row operation of -4 R1 plus R2, which is going to give us, the first row stays the same, 1, 2, 3, and then 4 minus 4 is going to be 0, so that is why we want to do minus 4r1 plus r2. So 0, and then we do minus 4 times 2 plus 6 basically, and that is going to give us minus 2. And then for the last one is going to be minus 4, and then the last row stays the same. We didn't do anything to that yet. Now again, look for the pivots. First pivot is going to be 1. Now our next pivot is going to be -2, and we have a 5 below it, right? As we can see over here. So how do we get rid of this 5? I mean, we can do row 2 multiplied by 2.5 r2 plus r3, but I think it's better to just convert this -2 into 1, so that it's more easier to perform the operations. So here what I'm going to do is I am going to do the row 2 divided by -half r2. So this will give us 1 2 3, and then 0 1 2, and then we have 0 5 3. So now you see why I did that. So now we can just do minus 5 r2 plus r3, and this will give us, I'll write it over here, it's gonna give us 1 2 3, and then 0 1 2, and then the last row is gonna be 0 0 -7, and that's it. So now if we can see, we have 3 pivots here, the first one, the second one, and third one, and we don't have any values below these pivots. Now let's do an example of 4 by 4 matrix. So we have 3 -6. Okay, this is going to take a while to write. I'm just going to quickly write it. So here now we have a 4 by 4 matrix, and let's begin. So the first pivot that we have in the first row is going to be 3, and we realize that we have numbers below it, right, which is this 2 over here and this 2. So we could do row 1 multiplied by 2 over 3 plus row 3 and 4, but it's always more easier to convert the pivots into 1 to be able to do the calculations quickly and don't have any fractions. So one thing to avoid is not to have fractions. It's going to be confusing and it's going to be complicated. So here I'm going to do 1 over 3 or 1. So this is going to give us 1 -2 3 and then 1, and everything else stays the same. Now we can do the operations of minus 2 r1 plus r3, and then minus 2 r1 plus r4, and this will give us, the first row stays the same, second row also stays the same, and the third row is going to become 0 10 -5 0, and then we have 0 0 0 -1. So now if we look at this, we have the first pivot to be 1, and we don't have any values below it, so that's good. Second pivot is also 1, but we do have a 10 over here, so we need to get rid of this 10 now, and we can do that by doing simply minus 10 r2 plus r3, and this will give us the answer of 1 -2 3 1 0 1 1 -1, and then this is going to become 0 0 -15, and then 10, and here it's going to be 0 0 0 -1. And now if you look for the pivots and see if we have RREF form, this is the first pivot, second pivot, third pivot, fourth pivot, and we don't have any values below it. So that's all for this video. If you would like me to do more examples on REF, I'll be more than glad to make the video. And as always, I do have a shortcut for you guys on the calculator to get the final answer. So if you want, I can make a short video on that. It's always best to recheck. It's like a method to recheck your answer, final answer, since you're doing so many calculations or addition, subtraction here. So you might be making a small silly mistake, and that changes the entire final answer. So I will be making that short video soon, and thanks for watching.